Okay, and we can go ahead and get started. I don't think this is an actual meeting, is it?
What month is it? August?
It's August. This is not a
Oh.
meeting. This is just a casual meeting.
No, not till November.
So, so the first thing is let me do a share here, and we can do the pledge. Share screen, and I want to share this one. Okay, so we'll do it the way we always do. Everybody else can mute, and you just follow along with me because the timing will be off otherwise. So I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, and then let's end that. Stop sharing. All right, there we go. Just for you who, because I don't think we've had a meeting since we did field day. Those of you who didn't make it, we had a very successful, I would say, field day. We had people setting up Friday evening and kind of like pre-staging and getting some stuff up. We ran from start to finish. Some were there for the whole time. Others came and went. Joe said we made somewhere between 100 and 200 contacts. So we had, and this year there was no car show. So we didn't have to compete with all of that and all of the noise. The Laporte Club was there. They set up a little station, but they didn't do a lot of operating. So it was mostly us, and we had a good time. We had nice tents, and the tower on the trailer, thanks, and the generator, thanks to the fine folks at the EMA and to Joe and Matt for helping to arrange for that. So that made things very nice. We had good food, and we had a good time. So I have got a couple of other, at least one more speaker lined up right now. And that's Carl Litzel-Schwab, who's with the league, and he's one of the reps for our area. And at this point right now, I don't remember exactly what we discussed him talking about. I just emailed another gentleman who gave a presentation on toroids and how to use them properly. So hopefully I'll hear back from him. And I'm going to figure out when we can squeeze this in. We're going to bring Bob back, because God knows he's got enough to talk about. Maybe he'll talk about the breadboard radio project, and he's got more road stories for days. So, and it was a very popular talk as well. And Bob's more than happy to come back. So all right. We haven't gotten word on whether or not we can meet in person in September. We were going to try talking to the elks or moose, one of those big animals with antlers, about whether or not we can use their banquet facility. But right now I'm a little concerned with the rising surge in cases around here. That may not be possible, in which case we'll just keep doing this as long as we need to. And then we'll see how things go around the holidays. So, all right. So let us go now to this evening's presentation. I follow Neil Rapp, who has spoken to us before. He's my coworker, partner, brother in Amateur Radio Newsline. Has his own podcast called Ham Talk Live, and he has interviews every week in the call-in segment. And a couple of weeks ago, the gentleman to my right was his guest on the show and talked all about remote antenna tuners and the pluses and minuses and what to look for when you're doing it and why you should use one versus a desktop tuner. So I thought that'd be a great thing to talk about here. John Portune also is a frequent writer for QST and knows his stuff. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to him. I will ask everybody to mute so you don't draw focus to yourself. And then John's going to start sharing the screen, and he will take it from there. So over to you, John Portune, W6NBC. And you are muted. You're allowed to unmute yourself.
Now, there we are.
That's better.
Okay, let me go over here and share my screen. Get this PowerPoint presentation up here and start it here. Okay, there we go. Slideshow from the beginning. There we go. All right, I recommend to you that you turn off your little icon screens if you have them over there on the right. Just go to the top of them. You'll see a little bar with 4 icons. Click on the minus one. It'll get rid of everything but a little line of stuff up there, because might cover up some of the things that my PowerPoint has. There we go. I've got mine turned off. All righty. Well, here is a question that many hams, probably particularly newer hams, or those who are maybe not highly knowledgeable in ham radio, probably never thought they'd ever ask. Why in the heck should I buy a remote auto tuner? I'm happy with the one I got. Well, that's what we want to talk about tonight, because I have found in the recent several years that the auto tuner is something that hams in general need to be much more aware of it, the remote auto tuner. Antenna tuners, of course, are not something that hams are unfamiliar with. Here I have a picture of probably the most famous or infamous tuner of the past. This is a desktop tuner going way back to the Johnson Viking days. Still a tuner that you find still in use. Great piece of work. And they're still available, and they still fetch pretty good money on the internet. So tuners aren't exactly new. But to a lot of hams, even many advanced hams, tuners are still a mystery in many ways. I know this because I keep hearing a lot of myths about tuners, opinions that are just not patently not true. So this is to some degree, as the Star Trek Enterprise is finding out here when they were probing into undiscovered country. This topic is a little bit of an undiscovered country topic. And unfortunately, we don't always meet the kind of characters we like, like the Klingons and so forth. So there may be a few things in this talk that won't come exactly with a great welcome to many hams who think they know all about antenna tuners. Now, there are 2 reasons I find that hams are not familiar or are still confused a bit by auto tuners. And there are 2 reasons, this one and another one, which work together. This one is that there are 2 categories of antenna tuners. There's not one universal tunes-all such thing as a tunes-all antenna tuner. There just isn't. They need to be configured for more particular job, and we'll see what the job is here in a minute. Some of you may know this stuff well, but some of you may not. The 2 classes of antenna tuners that we have, the in-shack tuner, or the on-the-desk tuner, the one that you find beside your radio, and the remote tuner, which is one out at the antenna. Many hams only think in terms of that top one. I bought that great MFJ tuner, and that's all I'll ever need. For example, here is that MFJ tuner. I own this particular one. Nice tuner, use it quite a bit. But it's one that you typically put beside your rig in your shack. And a lot of hams labor under the impression that's all the tuner I'll ever possibly need. No, that is not the all tuner you'll ever possibly need. And that's what we want to get to today here. And even if this is not exactly welcome information to some people who think this is the only tuner they'll ever need. Now, a more recent other class of in-shack tuner, or in your station tuner as opposed to out there, is the auto tuner. you'll find in rigs. Here's a nice expensive Kenwood radio, TS990, lovely radio. And you'll notice where the arrow is pointing over to AT for auto tuner. This has an automatic antenna tuner built in. And a lot of hams, particularly those who maybe need a little more theory than they have, think, oh, joy, now I've got an auto tuner built into my rig. I don't need any other auto tuner. Not true. In fact, I've unfortunately, because of some of the things I've recommended, have had hams who have destroyed that auto tuner because they think it's the only kind of an auto tuner that there is, and try to use it on the wrong kind of an antenna. And that's too bad. And I've had to tell people, I'm sorry, Charlie, you got to send your Kenwood back to Kenwood and get it fixed. And don't try to tune that kind of an antenna up anymore. We also find these guys. Here's a nice, great big Palstar full gallon auto tuner that goes beside your rig. I happen to have an LDG full gallon auto tuner sitting right beside my rig. I'm looking right at it now, an LDG AT1000. Both very good auto tuners that go in your shack and very useful auto tuners. Then there's the class of tuner, which we're here to really talk about tonight. Remote or at the antenna tuner. And many hams think, why in the world would you ever want to put the tuner out there? Doesn't it? All tuners go beside your rig, don't they? No. Well, here is the original, the first one that really appeared on the market, and this was probably well over 20 years ago. This was the tuner that SDG, I think, or yeah, I think that's the SGC brought out. The SGC 239. By the way, you can still buy this tuner, good auto tuner, designed primarily not to go in your shack, but out at the antenna. And this is a 200 watt model. I used one of these in my mobile rig to feed a CB whip on the back bumper. Worked great. Here's perhaps a more familiar auto tuner that got the idea of auto tuners, remote auto tuners, into the ham community. This is the little AH4 built by ICOM. I also have one of these. I have this mounted in the front of the bed of my pickup truck, also feeding a CB whip right behind the cab in my pickup truck. Works brilliantly well. I've had shootouts with big Hunga screwdriver antennas, and people are amazed. You mean that CB whip in an auto tuner works as well as my super duper screwdriver? Yes, it does. Here's one that's pretty popular. MFJ makes this one, our friends at Mighty Fine Junk. This is a good tuner, actually. Like a 300 watt tuner will handle that much. The only objection I have to it is the case could use a little better sealing, but a little RTV will take care of that, not a problem. And available for a little more money, but good tuner. All right, the second reason hams don't understand the auto tuner, the remote auto tuner, is because they don't recognize that there are two classes of antennas. All antennas aren't the same. Thomas Jefferson was wrong when he said all men are created equal. He was also wrong if we say all antennas are created equal. They aren't. There are two classes of antennas. Antennas that we call resonant antennas, and antennas that we should call non-resonant antennas. Most antennas can be either one of these, depending on circumstance, but in general, there are two classes. And just like tuners, which hams think belong in the shack, most hams think the only kind of an ham antenna is a resonant antenna. Let's understand the difference, and I know some of you know this quite well, but let's make it really clear. Here are 4 examples of resonant antennas, the kind of antennas that most hams think are the only kind of antennas. The big beam up there on the left, I don't know what that is, a TH6 or something like that. And in the middle is a spider beam. Maybe some of you have a spider beam. On the right is a Hustler, I think that's a 5 BTV. And on the left is the lowly dipole. A piece of wire that you have intentionally cut using the magic 468 over megahertz. All of these antennas on their frequencies are resonant antennas. That is, if you hook an antenna analyzer to any one of these on the frequency they're meant to operate on or built to operate on, they'll show you low SWR, just like that diagram on the right shows you the 5BTV. On those bands, the SWR reaches almost 1-to-1. And that's essentially the definition of an antenna, or an antenna when it is resonant. An SWR analyzer connected to the feed point will show a 1-to-1 or close to 1-to-1 SWR at the frequency you intend to operate it on. That's a resonant antenna. Again, lots of new hams think that's the only kind of antennas there are. No, not by any means, any more than the in-shack tuner is the only kind of a tuner you'll ever need. Here's some examples of non-resonant antennas that are built to be non-resonant. On the left is a Humvee there with the top off, military version, and on it is mounted a whip, which is a non-resonant whip. That is, if you tried to hook an SWR analyzer to this antenna, it wouldn't show you a 1-to-1 SWR on any of the bands that the military wants to use it on. So it's not surprising that right next to it you see an auto tuner, because that's where the auto tuner goes, at the base remote auto tuner. That auto tuner will now make that antenna a resonant antenna on the bands they want to use it on. But by itself, it's a non-resonant antenna. On the right is another antenna, a non-resonant antenna that some hams may like to use. That's one of those windsock poles that you can buy from various sources. MFJ sells some nice big ones, mounted on a grounded mast, being fed by an AH4 random wire auto tuner. Again, that mast with the coil of wire wound around it or run up the middle of it is a non-resonant antenna. Hook an antenna analyzer to it, no 1-to-1 SWR. In the middle is an antenna that I get lots of questions about. What about using the rain gutters on my house? Yeah, you can do it. I've done it several times and don't like it, but what the heck? A lot of hams try it, and maybe some hams use it. But it is also a non-resonant antenna. You might cut it to a specific length and get it to be on one frequency, but generally speaking, a random length of wire running around the rain gutters, or your rain gutters all tied together, are generally not going to be resonant on any ham band. Hence, they need a remote auto tuner to tune them up, or some other tuning network. Now, I say you need a remote auto tuner for all of these. Not exactly. A simple L-match network in a sealed box would work too. That just takes a little more work, and it's not so easy to change bands. But that's what I tend to use most of the time, as you'll see. Other non-resonant antennas, which many hams don't look at them as non-resonant antennas, but they are. The random long wire. Now, the end-fed long wire is coming back into popularity. This is the kind of an antenna everybody up till about 1930 used, including Marconi. If you'd have told Marconi, hey, Gelimo, you need to tune up that antenna, he'd say, no, an antenna is just a random piece of wire. No, it's not. In fact, it's been estimated if Marconi had a simple G5RV there at his place in Newfoundland, he'd have crossed the Atlantic very easily in 1903. Anyway, other non-resonant antennas, ZEPs. They can be resonant, but oftentimes they're not. Windhams, Carolina Windham and others, sometimes resonant, sometimes not. Off-center fed dipoles. I like off-center fed dipoles, great antennas, but generally speaking, they're non-resonant. There's no place, they hook up to them, and they don't show you a low SWR on the frequency you want. They can with certain other matching networks. But a typical example of an antenna that you might think is a resonant antenna, but isn't, when you use it differently, take a 40-meter dipole. You put that, it's your first antenna, it's the new BAM, out in the backyard, and suddenly you get an itch to work 20 meters. You've heard that's a great band. So you get out your antenna tuner in your shack and you hook it up and you tune it up on 20 meters. That's a non-resident antenna, and that's the wrong approach to do this. So any antenna that you try to tune up on a band that it wasn't designed for is a non-resident antenna, generally speaking. And it's where you need the auto tuner at the base. Okay, here's the quintessential, in my view, non-resident, high-performing ham antenna. The famous 43-foot vertical with 16 43-foot above-ground radials. Many hams think this is a wonder antenna, the best of all antenna. And believe me, it is a very good antenna. If you do easy neck and model it, you'll see that it is a great performer. Here's a guy here adjusting his antenna. But the 43-foot vertical is a non-resonant antenna. It is not a ham band antenna. You've got to do something to make it into a ham band antenna. Let me prove this to you. Here's a Easy Neck 4 SWR plot of a 43-foot vertical over 16 43-foot elevated radials, just like you were seeing in the previous picture. And there's the SWR of that antenna on all frequencies across the HF band, HF spectrum. You'll notice that the SWR of this antenna is only resonant, meaning that it has less than a 3-to-1 SWR on 3 specific frequencies, none of which are ham bands: 5.5 megs, 17 megs, and well, now take that back. It does have a resonance on 10 meters. A 43-foot vertical can be fed directly with coax on 10 meters, and you don't need a tuner. But on all the other ham bands, 3.5, 5, 7, 10, 14, 18, 21, and 25, that's a non-resonant antenna. You can't hook coax directly to that antenna. On those frequencies, it's a non-resonant antenna. Here's how I got introduced to non-resonant antennas. This is my little mobile home. Typical small mobile home. I like mobile home living. And my nicely landscaped front yard, which my wife is most responsible for. And there's my flagpole antenna. I thought if I've going to work ham bands here in this mobile home where antennas are forbidden, the homeowners association will come down on you like a ton of bricks if you put up a ham antenna. And so I thought the way I'm going to get away with it is a flagpole. Sure, every ham's looked at a flagpole and thought, "Ooh, wouldn't that make a great antenna?" But then, where am I going to put the radials? Am I going to dig up that concrete? Am I going to dig up all that lovely landscaping and try to bury radials under that? Besides, the lot isn't even big enough. So what did I do? I decided the only way I can make a flagpole work is to make it a half wave no radial flagpole, so that it is a fully resonant antenna all by itself without radials. It's the only kind of an antenna I could get away with. What did I have to do? I had to put an insulator at the base, which you can see the lower arrow, and I had to put an insulator somewhere up in the middle of the antenna. I researched all different heights, and it doesn't make much difference where you feed it. Antennas don't care, as long as you match it properly. And so I put it at 4 feet, which is an easy height to reach. So this is an off-center fed, non-resonant, no radial HF flagpole that works all bands with a remote auto tuner. Now, let me give you a more practical example from another realm, not ham radio, but from marine radio. This is where auto tuners get used a great deal. I thought, because I had a sailboat for quite a number of years, used to sail the coast of Southern California, I thought once the 2 megahertz, which you can see there at the bottom, marine band went away, which all boats used to use, the 2 megahertz AM band, and the 500 kilohertz band went away from the marine community, that there wasn't any more HF activity on the marine bands. Oh, far from it. here you can see the marine bands in black and the ham bands in red. And you can see they've got all the marine community has almost as many bands as we do. Where do they use it? They use it for ships that go to sea. Now, the coastal ships use VHF for the boating, but when they go to sea, VHF isn't any good, and it isn't of any use, and reach far enough. So still, on the high seas, all ships that go on the high seas are equipped with HF marine radios, now almost exclusively single sideband. Here's an example. Here's a fishing trawler, I think. And I put this up as I made this diagram for the radio club talk I gave in the Pentagon. The Pentagon has a nice amateur radio club, and they have one of these Shakespeare 5300 marine 28-foot marine whips mounted on the top of the Pentagon, and it's fed with a remote auto tuner or a coupler, as they tend to call it in the marine world. So this is you can see it here. You have the auto coupler at the base of the whip, or you can put the auto coupler up on top and run a wire antenna to that mast at the front. And then you take a ground wire down to a big metal plate on the bottom of your boat for the ground to the seawater. This is a great HF antenna, and lots of blue water sailboaters use this when they put out to sea. And so HF is very much alive in the boating community, and they're all big fans of remote auto tuners. I'll show you this picture just for a little bragging. I made a visit to the last of the 500 kilohertz stations that are still operating in the United States. It's up at radio station KPH, started as in the Palace Hotel in San Francisco as K Palace Hotel, eventually moved out to Point Reyes, which is north of San Francisco. And here's me at the console of KPH, since I hold a radio telegraph license as well. They let me go on the air and send out a bulletin on 500 kilohertz and 6 other HF frequencies simultaneously. And since they have a receiving station 15 miles away that comes back on a phone line, I could hear myself transmitting on 18 how much power was I running? 18 kilowatts or something. Yeah, 18 kilowatts on CW. It's the last CW I think I've done. All right, let's get down to the nitty gritty here. How does an auto tuner work? Many of you know this, but some of you might not. You might, and I think you'll find it interesting to review it anyway. Philip Smith, the brilliant antenna designer of some years ago, who wrote the famous book on the Smith chart. You know, most hams know of the Smith chart. Not too many hams can use one, but if you do, and at least if you understand it basically, and here's a Smith chart on the left, which is a graphic representation of all the impedances an antenna can present to the feed line, from high resistance to low resistance, to high inductive reactance to low inductive reactance, all plotted on this polar chart called the Smith chart. Philip Smith pointed out in that book, though, that any place on that chart can be matched with 4 simple L matches, which I've shown here overlaid on the chart. The upper left section with that L match, which is a parallel L in, a series L out, the antennas on the right, the transmitters on the left. Or to the right there, it can be matched with a series coil in and a parallel coil out. Or on the bottom with you can see the 4 L matches. Those simple networks with just a single coil and a single capacitor, one of those 4 will match anything on a Smith chart. Now, of course, at certain places on the Smith chart, the values become so huge that they're not physically practical to use. But in concept, those 4 L matches can match anywhere on a Smith chart. And that's what the auto tuner uses, that principle, uses this concept in the design of the remote auto tuner. Philip Smith also noticed that the left side of the chart with the parallel in L matches, they match low impedances. The L matches on the right, where the parallel element is on the output of the L match, they match the high impedance end of the chart. And that's how the Smith chart is organized. High impedance at the right, low impedance at the left. Okay, here's the net or the schematic diagram of a remote auto tuner. Very, very basic design. There are a whole series of coils, all hooked in series, and a whole series of capacitors. And those coils and the capacitors may be added to each other or taken away from each other by an equal number of relays, just common ordinary relays, plus one additional relay which selects for the low impedance end of the chart or the high impedance end of the chart, which Philip Smith pointed out is very basic to the Smith chart. You'll notice that the coils are in a binary sequence, 16, 8, 4, 2, 1, so forth, and that the capacitors are also in a binary or doubling sequence, 5, 10, 20, 40, 80. And that's how all these antenna tuners are configured, with 7 or 8 coils, 7 or 8 capacitors, and 15 relays, 15 or 17 relays, to switch these in and out and configure the matching network between the in and the out as one of those 4 L matches that you saw on the Smith chart. And they work very, very well. Since they're binary, they can, by switching in the correct number, you can get any value between 5 puff and twice 640 puff, or between between a quarter of a microhenry, an eighth of a microhenry, and 32 microhenries, which is a big range in L matches, and will match a great deal of the Smith chart. Now, the original design for this type of a tuner was done by Dwayne Kincaid, WDOYG, who was working for LDG tuners at the time, and built this first auto tuner. It was called the AT11. Here's the circuit board of it, that an LDG makes one very similar to it to this day. Called it the AT11, and he published an article on it in QST back in 1996, and it was the sort of the beginning of the auto tuner day, remote auto tuner. You'll notice the coils on the right, the blue arrow, a row of in this case 8 inductors with a binary sequence of coil turns on it. And on the right, you can't quite see them there because they're end on end, silver mica capacitors, again in a binary sequence. And you'll also see the 17 relays, 8 for the capacitors, 8 for the coils. And up at the top, a CPU and an SWR bridge, which allows the CPU to know what the SWR is as it switches all of these in. So when you hit the tune button, and many of you have an auto tuner, you know what this is like. Sounds like popcorn popping. It goes as all the relays try out all the combinations of 8 times 8 until it finds the one with the lowest SWR and then leaves it there. That's how the remote auto tuner works. Great idea, great concept, and it works very well. By the way, I include this one in case some of you don't know about it. There's a little auto tuner, full-blown auto tuner, has all of the components. You can see the capacitors at the bottom, the coils in the middle, and the relays. This one only uses 7 in each bank, which is enough. And the one in the middle there, between the 2 rows, which is the one for the high-low impedance. You'll see the microprocessor on the right and the bit of the SWR bridge on the left. You can buy this little tuner on Amazon. Just search for an ATU100, and you can see the size of it between my fingers. They're not very big. Full-blown auto tuner for about $70, I think it is. So you don't have to spend a lot of money on an auto tuner. I intend to put one of these in a sealed box, put it out at the antenna, and use it as a remote auto tuner. All right, now here's the nitty-gritty of this talk. Fundamental reason for all tuners. Okay, here we see a typical ham station in schematic, or in pictorial. On the left is a source of RF. On the right is a typical resonant antenna in this case. And in the middle, a piece of 70 or 50 ohm transmission line connecting the two. Now, all three of these, if you want your antenna to work, your station to work efficiently, all three of these have to be 50 ohm devices for the full power transfer to take place between the source of RF, your rig, and the antenna, the place where the radio waves are made, down a piece of 50 ohm transmission line. That's the configuration, as many of you know well already, so I'm just giving you something basic here to emphasize the principle here. All of these three elements of any ham station have to all be the same impedance, or 50 ohms in most cases for hams. By the way, 50 ohms is the best power handling impedance for transmission line. Now, why are these 50 ohms? Well, let's look at the source of RF. Well, the reason your transceiver is a 50 ohm device and not a 200 ohm device or an 87 ohm device is because it produces current, I and R, or E and I, in a ratio. So much voltage for so much current. And when you put it into simple Ohm's law, the ratio that always comes out of your transceiver of the voltage and the current, always by Ohm's law, is 50 ohms. So that's why your transceiver is a 50 ohm RF source. The transmission line is made to be 50 ohms by its construction. And the antenna, if it's a resonant antenna, has been made 50 ohms by the manufacturer. This is the standard ham setup that most hams think about. But many hams believe, and this is the big myth, many hams believe that there are two ways to use a tuner. No, there aren't. Well, there are, but not two right ways. Here they are. In other words, you can have the tuner in the shack by your transceiver and an antenna out there fed in between by a long piece of coax or open wire line. And the other way is to put the tuner out at the antenna, and they have the coax or the transmission line between the transceiver and the auto tuner. Pretty much has to be an auto tuner out there, though not really, as I'll show you. However, if in the case where you have a resonant antenna, both of these are satisfactory ways to do it. You can use the auto tuner at the antenna, or you can use the tuner in your shack, and this is going to work fine. There will be low loss in the transmission line if this is what you do. And this is the way most ham antennas are configured until you start putting up a 43-foot vertical. But if you put up a non-resonant antenna out there away from your shack, such as in this case, there's my flagpole, my non-resonant flagpole sitting out there, but you leave the tuner in the shack, but you still try to feed this with a long run of coax, you're going to get terrible loss in your coax. And this is something that many hams don't realize. It isn't the tuner that's making the loss. It's the coax. You know, Einstein said the universe abhors a vacuum. He should have said coax abhors high SWR. And that's, of course, what a non-resonant antenna is going to cause in that piece of transmission line following the tuner in the shack. The only way to feed a non-resonant antenna out there is to put the coax in front of the tuner. That is, put the tuner at the base. And usually you want it to be an auto tuner so you don't have to walk out there and change things. Although I've been doing that recently and I find it quite satisfactory. Here's a little table that most of you may be familiar with. You'll find it in your handbook if you want to look in there, or any good book like Terman or Jansky or one of the other big radio guru handbooks. It's the loss in coax or transmission line, because I'm also showing 300 ohm ribbon and 450 ohm ribbon. It's the loss in 100 feet of all of these on the various bands. And you can see RG58 up there top is terrible transmission line, as we well know. Really only good for short runs, no matter where you're using it. Maybe from your rig in your car to the little whip on the back trunk, you might use it. because on 80 meters, there's the loss of 0.9 dB, but at 450, there's a 13.2 dB loss in 100 feet of RG8. Okay, here are all the losses. You're familiar with these. I want to point out something to you, though, as we look at this chart. We'll see it again. Look at the 300 ohm transmission ribbon at the bottom, TV ribbon, as we often call it. What's the losses in it? Well, you can see them there on the line, 80 meters through 70 centimeters. Pretty low loss. But notice the LMR 400, which is coax, right above it. Not much different, is it? Don't think the 300 ohm ribbon line is no loss. There's no such thing as a low loss transmission line. But what's the point of this chart? This is the loss in transmission line only when there's a matched antenna out there, only when there's a resonant antenna out there at the other end. If you put a non-resonant antenna on out there, all of these losses go to the sky, as I'll show you next. Here's a chart that I put together. And you can see here, I'm showing all these transmission lines, now including 600 ohm line, open wire line as we really call it, for 80 meters, 10 meters, and 2 meters, so to the bottom of HF, the top of HF, and 2 meters. I didn't show the other bands, but the point is clearly made here. Now you can see if the SWR, which is the top of all of these three, is the 1-to-1, which is the figures I just showed you, the losses are not bad. Even on 2 meters, you're still going to get 34 watts out of 100 watts out of 100 feet of RG58. But look what happens if the SWR goes up. I've also shown you what you get out of 100 feet of all of these lines if you raise the SWR by putting a non-resonant antenna out there. Not too bad for the, not too horrible at 10-to-1. You still get reasonable amounts of power out. But look what happens when you get 100-to-1 SWR. You say, I never get 100-to-1 SWR. Oh, yes, you will. On some of those bands of a non-resonant antenna, the SWR can go way over 100-to-1. So look down there at 2 meters at 1,000-to-1 SWR on 2 meters with 100 feet of 600 ohm line. Only 3 watts is going to come out the other end. 2 watts if it's 450 ohms. 1 watt if it's, or 1 watt if it's LMR 400. Again, coax is only going to come out. RG8 also 1 watt, but RG8X or RG58, you're not going to get any appreciable power at all if you've got 100 feet of any kind of a transmission line feeding a non-resonant antenna that has an SWR of 1,000-to-1. Coax abhors SWR. So the conclusion of this, and this is a conclusion that all hams need to stick in their head, even if they don't like it, because this is not pleasant to some people who think my auto tuner in my rig is the only tuner I'll ever need. No, it isn't. Not if you're running a non-resonant antenna. And by the way, don't try to tune up a non-resonant antenna through 100 feet of RG8 with your tuner in your shack. You're likely to blow up that tuner. Now, here's a sidebar myth that I want to conclude with. Lots of hams believe a myth, and the myth is, I don't like tuners. Tuners are lossy. No, tuners are not lossy. The reason is, what's inside of a tuner? Just coils and capacitors, inductive reactance and capacitive reactance. Inductive reactance and capacitive reactance, as it says at the bottom, creates no loss. Only the small losses in the coil and the small losses in the capacitor inside of that tuner, then they're only small, do not create much loss. I took this quote off of the QRZ forum. Usually, tuner losses are very small, even if the tuner is built with large high-Q components. So don't believe the myth that tuners are lossy devices. They are not. What's the lossy device? It's the coax that you try to put after a tuner feeding a non-resonant antenna. There's where all the loss is. But this is what makes a lot of hams think that tuners are lossy. They try to tune up their 20-meter beam on 40 meters through 100 feet of RG8, and they don't get much power out. Why? It's the coax, not the tuner, that's eating the power. So that's the principle. I know this isn't well received by a lot of people who want to think that all they need is that tuner in the shack, but this is the truth. If you want to run non-resident antennas, you better think in terms of a tuner out at the antenna. Let me give you a closing example. Here's an antenna that you may know something about. It's my double inverted delta slot antenna. This is in my backyard. It's a non-resonant antenna on all the ham bands. Doesn't tune up resonant on any ham band. You'll notice the little blue box there at the bottom of it. That's a tuner underneath a Rubbermaid. We got somebody's mic on. Rubbermaid tub. Underneath that, I built my. Somebody's got their mic unmuted. Underneath that blue tub is this simple little manual L match. I built this for about $50 at most, maybe even less, from off of eBay stuff, a rotary capacitor and a rotary inductor. I mean, a variable capacitor and a rotary inductor. And I have this at the base of that non-resonant double inverted delta slot antenna. And what I do is I tuned it up once on all bands, so I know where the dials are set on all bands. And then I put marks on the front of it. All I do if I want to change bands is step outside, lift up the Rubbermaid tub, set this on the band I want to work, and walk back in the house. 5 minutes and I'm on another band. Yes, a remote auto tuner is convenient, but I don't need it. This little guy works just as well. And then I have no danger of blowing up the remote auto tuner. Finally, let me give a shameless commercial for my Amazon Kindle book on slot antennas, which contains that antenna, by the way. So we're going to pause here for this important messages. You'll find it on Amazon. Just search for slot antennas for ham radio, or you can use the little QR code there at the bottom and get the direct address to it. It's just $4.95. If you ever wondered about slot antennas, which I did, it's where I learned a lot of these principles, this book will tell you all about it. And that's it, people. If you want to contact me, there's my email, w6nbcmail@gmail.com, or you can contact me through my website, W6NBC, or you can use the QR code up there at the top and you get both of those. And there's my little doggie. Her name is Lolly, actually. And you know she does not have a call sign, but I pretend that she does. I pretend that her call sign is D0GGY and that I bought her in Germany. No, I didn't. I got her here locally. But she's my second operator most of the time. Great little pooch. And that's all, folks.
All right. Thank you very much, John. That was quite interesting. Oh, let me turn my camera back on. I have a question.
Sure.
You mentioned the 43-foot vertical.
Yeah.
I have one that I have yet to quite figure out the proper way to feed it. I have a small LDG auto tuner on it, but it's never quite able to make it work. If I use an auto tuner, do I feed? I don't use any sort of balun or any sort of on between, right? I feed the antenna directly from the tuner.
Yeah, indeed. Most auto tuners, although they're typically today have an SO239 output jack on it. But do not fear hooking directly up to that SO239 and the ground of the tuner down to ground. That'll work just fine. That's how I feed my flagpole, or I feed this or I feed that double inverted delta slot. No, most auto tuners will work just fine. if you, however, you're going to want a balun on the other side of the tuner so that you isolate the tuner from the antenna, isolate the ground aspect of the tuner from the antenna. I use a simple 1-to-1 choke balun.
Okay.
That's what I use. So the basic setup for using an auto tuner at the base of the G5 at the 43-foot vertical is rig, coax, auto tuner, 1-to-1 balun, and then ground the tuner.
Okay. I'll give that a shot.
Well, it'll work like a champ. But frankly, most 43-foot verticals will work just as well with that little simple L match I showed you. Or you can even make up discrete L matches, just a single plug-in coil and capacitor. A little bit of more work, however, and not quite so handy.
I had started, there was plans in QST for a switched matching network to do 80 and it was 80 and 160 or 80 and 40 with the relays that switch to coil in and out. So that was my other option. I basically, I've got a Hustler 4 BTV with a 12 and a 17 meter element tacked onto the side for most of my HF, but I desperately want to get on 80. And I live in a condo, so I can't just throw wires up everywhere. So
you certainly can't.
I got the 43-foot out back that I want to try.
Well, the remote auto tuner is a piece of cake. I use it virtually for all antennas these days. I haven't touched my in-shack tuners in a long time.
Okay.
But because you can always put it out at the antenna. You can't lose if you do that. If you put it in the shack, you can, if you're trying to feed a non-resonant antenna. By the way, that 43-foot vertical is a great antenna. What kind of radials have you got down for it?
Well, they're less than ideal, but I got like, I think 25 down of various lengths. The problem is it's about 4 feet from the back of our condo. So to the north, I can't really put anything. So I got like 270 degrees roughly of radials.
Oh, that'll be fine.
Yeah.
I'm surprised how few radials you really need. 2 radials above ground in particular oftentimes work just perfectly well. Okay. Besides, if you've got the remote auto tuner out there at the shack, it doesn't really care. It'll tune it up and be pretty efficient.
All right, I'll refigure out how I've got that wired in then. Anybody else?
Usually this one doesn't get too many comments because it's pretty straightforward what we're seeing here. But
all right.
It's a principle I'm very much an advocate of, that hams in general need to get used to non-resonant antennas because there are many good designs. But they also need to get used to the fact that if they do put up a non-resonant, a long wire or whatever, they need some kind of a matching network at the base. Why do you think you need that 9-to-1 balun at the end of the random long wire that's become so popular?
Yeah.
Can't put that back in your shack. If you do, you're really going to kill yourself.
Exactly. All right. Well, if we have no further questions, one more time, anybody raise your hand, say hi.
All right. Very good presentation. Thank you.
All right. So thank you. Thank you very much, John. That was very informative, and I know it helped me. So,
well, I'll be happy to come back anytime you like. I've got a number of talks that I give. You can find them all at W6NBC.com, and be glad to talk to you anytime. In retirement now at 83, I don't have to make a living anymore. I do what I like to do, and I enjoy being a ham lecturer.
Great. Sharing the knowledge is the thing to do. So,
yep.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Yes, have a good evening. All right, guys. Anybody got anything else we want to discuss, or we call it a night?
Call it a night. Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you, Paul.
Since we can't go out to dinner, I already ate. And then I'll let you guys know when we have the next talk lined up. And we'll just keep going this way until we have, it's safe and we have a place to meet.
Sounds good.
and we'll go from there. And like I said, even when we do start meeting in person, we can do another one of these in between, because you don't have to go anywhere, get in the car. You
Yes.
can just sit here in your underwear if you want. Just don't stand up.
Well,
73.
I like the Zoom meeting, 7-3s.
Yeah,
7-3, yeah.
I do too. So, all right. Well, I'll call it a night then. And thanks everybody for showing up. And I will, as soon as it takes a while for this to process after I hit stop. And then we'll get that put up either on my channel or on Radio Joe's. So, all right. Good night. 73.
Good night, everybody.